Shall I start? So I'd like to welcome everybody. I would like to also introduce Mény Guy, who, if you look way up there, you can see, and Philip Genscher, who's down here, who are the co-organizers along with me of the Schumann seminar series. We will be meeting regularly twice a month. I hope many of you will be able to attend these lectures. They're listed on the schedule. I think we have some really marvelous speakers lined up. Sorry. Okay. Let me introduce today is the Yves Mény lecture, which is our kickoff lecture. So I will introduce Yves Mény, who will actually be the discussant today, and I can say a few words more about the Yves Mény lecture then. But let me introduce our speaker. We're fortunate to have Brigid Laffan, who is going to speak about Brexit, a topic which has maybe been a little bit subdued recently, but has perhaps reemerged in the news as well. Brigid is sort of the all-everything. She is, for starters, the director of the Schumann Center. She is a political scientist by background. She's done quite a lot of research on European governance, and indeed, up until this year, she was also personally running the European governance program within the Schumann Center. I could go through a lot of different things that she's done, but she probably wants to do a little bit of speaking too, so I won't do that. I'll just mention that she is she was elected a member of the rather ironically named, in my opinion, Royal Irish Academy, particularly perhaps ironic given today's topic. She is also, I should say, very active on social media. And if you'd like to know more about Brexit when she's done speaking, you might want to subscribe to her on Twitter. So, Brigid Laffan, who I'm proud to call a friend and who I'm also proud to call my boss. Please, take the floor.
Hi. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this, our COVID lecture. We really want to continue to have a community at Schumann to be able to meet, and this was the only place that we could meet in these kinds of numbers. So hence, we're outside on the lovely terrace. I hope it's not too hot. We had hoped it would be a little cooler, but please bear with us. Thank you, David, for the introduction, and thank you, David and Philip, for the invitation to give the annual Yves Mény lecture. And since I inaugurated this lecture series in 2014, and this is the 7th iteration, and in my last year, it's entirely appropriate that I get to do the work. When we inaugurated the lecture series, we did so because we wanted to honour Yves Mény, the founding director of the Schumann Center and, of course, former president of the European University Institute. But we also wanted to create institutional traditions and ritual because, as we know, the academic community of the EUI is very transient. We come and we go. We're here for 1 year, 2 years, 8 years, 10 years. And so it's very important for our institution that we have traditions that are handed over and carried on. And also, I'm very grateful to Yves to act as discussant today. Yves was the founding director of the Schumann Center, and writing in 2008, I think it was, on the foundation, 2005, on the foundation of the Schumann Center, he said it consisted of a director, an assistant, 2 secretaries, and 3 offices. That's what Schumann was at the very beginning, and someone else said to me, a couple of potted plants. And now, almost 30 years later, we now have the Schumann campus. We have thriving research programs. We bring in 8 to 10 million external research funding a year, and we have a wonderful, vibrant scholarly community. And so I am very pleased to deliver this, the 7th Yves Mény annual lecture, and I hope when I have gone that it will continue. What I want to talk about today is Brexit. This is work in progress. It's a book I'm writing and researching with Stefan Teller. We're at the beginning. We've got the reports from the reviewers. They're good, so we will get a contract. So the book will, we hope to complete the book, if not by the time I leave, shortly after. And the motivation to write this book and do this work is that the literature on Brexit has tended so far to be dominated by the UK perspective because of the extraordinary impact that Brexit has on the United Kingdom. But there's less on the EU side, on not just what it means for the EU, but also how the EU has responded. And there are some articles, but there haven't been any book-length studies of the EU response to Brexit. So that's the work that we're doing. It's, as I said at the beginning, but I think it will be. I'm really enjoying doing it already, and I'm really looking forward to completing this work. What I will do this afternoon is talk a little about Brexit in context, then on the response of the EU, which I will stylize as rapid, united and effective. And why? Because the EU drew on its collective capacity to frame Brexit, to mobilize resources and to defend its interests. And I will draw some conclusions. But firstly, Brexit in context. I'm not going to talk about the poly crisis. We all know, and many of us have contributed work in this field, the way in which the EU has been confronted by one crisis after another since the end of the first decade of the 21st century. The EU has been in crisis mode, one could argue, or a union in crisis. It's been both tested and contested. But in order to understand how the EU responded to Brexit, it's important to keep that context in mind. Because when, on the 23rd of January 2013, in his Bloomberg speech, David Cameron argued for a reform of the EU, but also a renegotiation of the terms of British membership, he was doing so at a time when this system could ill afford to pay attention to the United Kingdom. It had other problems, particularly the euro area and the refugee crisis. And so when Cameron came to the table, having got his overall majority in May 2015, he was making a major demand on a system already under strain and under stress, with political attention and political capacity not available. And it tells us that the capitals of the EU and the other member states really wanted to keep the UK as a member, that they were willing to open that dossier for Cameron at that particular time. And we have to remember what drove Cameron. So here he was asking 27 other countries, when they had very heavy and complex and tough political agendas, to talk about the UK. And he had two goals in mind. He wanted, firstly, to stop, and these are his words, he wanted to stop the Conservative Party banging on about Europe, and he wanted to stop UKIP in its tracks. So it was intra and inter-party competition that motivated the British request for a new settlement. But the system responded. The other member states had, as I said, better things to do, but they did respond. And in autumn 2015 to February 2016, they engaged actively with the British government on what Cameron wanted. Now, what he really wanted was a big reform of the EU to make it a more comfortable EU for the UK. This was not available. The other member states were not going to engage with one member state in this way. And so he had his four baskets of issues that he wanted an EU response to. The first was euro-related. The British, because of the City of London, were always concerned about banking union and other potential developments in the euro area that would damage a country on the outside. But the EU had already worked with the UK on banking union, and this was not a contentious issue. The second basket he described as competitiveness, but since all governments were talking about competitiveness at the time, this was not contentious either. The two that were contentious were what the British called the basket on sovereignty and the basket on free movement and migration. On sovereignty, Britain wanted to basically an opt-out for one of the founding symbolic phrases of the EU treaties, ever closer union. And on free movement and migration, They wanted basically an emergency break, but they certainly wanted to get some opt-outs on in-work benefits and things like that, just in order to be able to go back to the British people and say, we've got something on free movement. And Cameron was content with the deal that he got in February 2016. But it really didn't matter. It had absolutely no impact on the debate in the United Kingdom at all. Within days, the British tabloid press had said, there is nothing here, there is nothing new, this is entirely symbolic. Rees-Mogg described it as very thin gruel indeed. Gove said he would, in the referendum, would lead the Leave, and as we know, of course, Johnson also. Gove was a leaver. He truly believed that it would be better for the United Kingdom to not be a member of the EU, but Johnson, as we know, wrote 2 articles for the Telegraph, one saying he would support Remain and the other saying he would support Leave. As we know, the Leave won by a narrow majority, but a majority is a majority, although it was an advisory referendum, which meant the threshold was just 50%. But when I did early interviewing for this project with people in the council and in the commission, there was a lot of fury about Cameron. They felt that the system had worked to help Cameron and he had not gone and made a positive case for the UK remaining in the EU. He had basically fought the referendum on Project Fear and on the economic consequences, but had not protected the EU in the UK during the referendum. And there were many people, senior in the council, who were actually quite happy that this meant that the February deal would never come into operation. They felt that they had been almost too generous, and the thanks they got was Cameron didn't protect the discourse on the EU in the UK. And so on the 24th, or the evening of the 23rd of June, morning of the 24th of June 2016, then the Brexit shock had arrived. The EU had one more crisis to confront. And NBC, on the morning of the 24th, said in a headline, "Is Brexit the beginning of the end of the EU?" And equally, scholarly reactions in autumn 16, and all of these were written in autumn 16, basically identified Brexit as something that could well break the EU. Ben Rosemont, that Brexit was the defining question of contemporary European politics. Ivan Krastev, that disintegration was almost inevitable, that the United Kingdom vote to leave triggered the worst political crisis that the EU had ever faced. None of those statements have aged well. They were the immediate response of academics, but also the media. And it was clearly Brexit was a disintegrative moment in the history of the EU. There was a potential for domino effects, but the EU was determined that the disintegrative moment would not translate into disintegration. So the proposition, the argument we will make in this book, although again we may change over the next 6 to 8 months, but at the moment the argument we will make is that the EU response was extremely rapid, that the EU was and remains united, and that the EU response was effective. And by stylizing the EU response as effective, that's certainly open to argument. In terms of the existing literature, there hasn't been much written theorizing the EU response. Frank Schimmelfenning has done most. He's a piece on liberal intergovernmentalism and also a piece on what he calls differentiated disintegration. And here he places a lot of emphasis on the asymmetric relationship between the UK and the EU in economic terms, and therefore the superior bargaining power of the EU. And in the book, we will begin with this, but we will say that that's not a full or complete explanation, that there's too much on the emphasis on the economic and not the wider polity, and there's very little on the institutional capacity of the Union. So we take as a starting point where Schimmelpfennig ends, but we want to argue that the EU is a compound polity. It has a tendency towards fragmentation and segmentation. It has, in relative terms, a weak centre. But we argue that the propensity in the literature to highlight the limitations and weaknesses of the EU rather than its strengths and capacity. In other words, when you look at the round of how the EU responded to Brexit, it shows strength and capacity. And the EU, we will argue, has also been hardened by crisis. So how are we, and we begin with collective capacity, a bit like Michael Mann when talking about state capacity as infrastructural power, the ability to project, to arrive at a singular approach and project it internally and externally. And our argument is that Brexit has compelled the EU to draw on strengths, and these are twofold: its resources and identity as a polity, and market power and as a producer of public goods, a producer of all of those policy areas that countries now do together. In other words, Brexit compelled the EU not just to use its structural power, but its power to get things done, its power over. And the analytical framework of the volume, Power to and Power Over, we look firstly at the EU and how it framed Brexit, secondly, how it created institutional process and knowledge capacity, and thirdly, how it determined collective interests, and then we look at the negotiations. So in a nutshell, our argument is that by framing Brexit as external, systemic, and symmetric, this helped unity in the EU, which led to intensive institutional coordination and an ability to mobilize resources and develop joint methods. And here we see effectiveness. So that's broadly, in a nutshell, how the framework of the book and how the argument will be made. So firstly, we place a lot of emphasis in how the EU framed Brexit, and it did so very quickly. Framing matters because when political systems have a shock, then they've got to define what the problem is, and there are great stakes in problem definition, as Kingdon argues, and frames are powerful nudges that affect the choice architecture that actors are faced with. So the EU had to develop an understanding of what Brexit meant to it, to interpret what Brexit meant, and therefore to develop a response. And rather than see it as an asymmetric shock to different parts of the EU and different member states, they framed it as systemic and external. And the speed of framing, we will argue that the framing between the 24th of June and the 29th of June, in other words, in that very first week, that not much has changed in how the EU has framed Brexit since then. And there were three different exercises. There was an individual statement by Donald Tusk, prepared for by his chef de cabinet, a statement of the four presidents, Tusk, Juncker, Schulz, and Mark Rutte was there because the Netherlands had the presidency, and then an informal European Council held on the 29th of June. And that was 1 week. So what was the first, how did they develop the frame? The first was unity. We're determined to keep our unity at 27. We're united in our response. We're determined to remain united. The word unity and united goes through every document on Brexit. Secondly, commitment to the Union, that the Union is the framework for the future, that the Union will continue. Now, all of this was rhetorical at the time because the EU didn't know if it could remain united, and it wasn't clear that the Union could be the framework to deal with the future. But that was the That was the initial framing. Thirdly, and this I think was really important, the UK was identified not as no longer an EU member state from the 24th of June, even though legally it was a member state, but it was a third country in the making. In other words, and this is a quote from the European Council, any agreement which will be concluded with the UK as a third country will have to be based on a balance of rights and obligations. And I think this was an important distinction between the 27 and the UK. The UK thought it was a member state negotiating a partnership with its former member state, with its former partners, that it was somehow in a status in the middle. It was not third country. And I remember using the phrase third country at a conference in London shortly after. And I remember people in the audience thinking that third country was a bit harsh. But if you leave the EU, that's what happens. You become a third country. Then process. The EU is the king of process, as we know. It likes train tracks. It likes process. And so it used Article 50. It said from the beginning that all the procedures for the withdrawal are there, they're clear, we've rules, and these processes and rules will have to be followed. Now, there was one thing the EU decided that was not in any treaty, but actually had an important bearing on the negotiations, and that was what was called NNWN. And that NNWN was no negotiation without notification. So the UK, we will not talk to the UK at bilateral, multilateral, EU level about Brexit until they tell us they're leaving. Until then, they're just a member state. When, mind you, a member state, a third country in the making. So this NNWN meant that the UK had no opportunity to engage with the EU informally to see what might be possible in the future relationship. But the EU was determined to insulate itself from being picked, that each capital could be picked off by the United Kingdom. And this was not a concern without substance, because the Foreign Office immediately did an analysis of every member state, all of its engagement with the EU, and pointed out what kinds of levers they could pull with each different member state. So they were thinking of the EU in fragmented terms. And this is the text analysis where you see unity, UK as a third country, and then you see market power Europe, the integrity of the single market and the integrity of the four freedoms. And interestingly, the integrity of the four freedoms, that phrase was in the June informal European Council at the insistence of Chancellor Merkel. She was on the plane going to Brussels. She was shown by her Sherpa what the concluding document of the informal council was. And she said, no, we need to, it can't just be integrity of the single market. The UK has to understand that implies the four freedoms. She did not want the freedoms to be unpicked. I think she was probably worried also about her own producers, that they may want her to unpick. So she wanted it in there from the very beginning. So the unity frame and the third country frame were extremely important. Now, the function of framing from an EU perspective, the first was coordination. This is a system of multiple actors, multiple levels, a very complex polity. And so if you were going to drive unity through this system, you needed a master narrative. And of course, you also needed something to communicate within the institutions and across the institutions, within the member states and externally. And I know that the EU has not always been a master of communication. In fact, it has had a pretty poor record. But what should not be underestimated was the extent to which, on Brexit, the system was extremely careful. They had what are called lines to take LTTs. So whenever there was an event in a vote in the House of Commons or a statement by a British Prime Minister, within 10 minutes there was an EU response. And that's because prior to the event itself, they'd all sat down together, the Council, the Commission, and if necessary, the capitals, to get consistency in the message and coherence. So framing, that early framing has stuck. But of course, unity is, at the beginning, was simply rhetorical. And the question is, how was it translated into a practice norm? How is it that very rarely in 4 years did any foreign minister or prime minister break that united facade? And the Michel Barnier, speaking in Dublin, or not in Dublin, remotely to Dublin on the 2nd of September, he argued that the unity of the 27 and the Parliament is not by chance, not falling from the sky. We're working on it every day. In other words, there was a lot of work, and through vertical and horizontal collaboration and institutional coordination, both formally and informally, went into the daily practice of we are united on Brexit. And so it almost got to the stage where a European politician could not afford to break the norm. It became almost, you can't do this and you can't go there. And a membership, both Article 50 allowed the EU to argue that membership must matter, that a non-member state of the Union that doesn't live up to the obligations cannot have the same rights and enjoy the same benefits. So in order then to generate the capacity in the EU to handle Brexit, the EU had to do a number of things. It was very concerned at the beginning that Brexit would impinge on all EU policymaking, on every dossier, on all legislation, that there would be no escape from Brexit. So what they did was they created an institutional bypass, a cordon sanitaire around Brexit in the institutions in order to stop the overflow of Brexit to the rest of what the EU did, and then they mobilized resources. So what was the institutional ecology? How did they use the institutional capacity of the EU? Well, firstly, within a week, 6 days, the Council Secretariat created a special task force on Brexit, headed by a lawyer, Didier Siwas, who was Van Rompuy's chef de cabinet. So technically very strong in law, but also well known in the member states. And at this stage, there was a debate as to who would negotiate Brexit. It wasn't entirely, Article 50 did not say it should be the Commission. But then the Commission, Juncker played his Barnier card, and he announced in July that Michel Barnier would be chief negotiator and head of a Commission task force on Article 50. And Barnier was an extremely important choice because he was a serious politician, had been a commissioner, knew the dossier, and would be trusted by the European Council. If it had been, and there was a debate, that it would be the deputy from DG Trade, then that simply politically wouldn't have worked. You needed a heavy hitter in order to insulate the Brexit negotiations and ensure that the member states would trust whoever was negotiating. And Barnier has personally worked extremely hard, visiting capitals, getting on fishing boats in Denmark, walking across the Irish border. He's worked very intensively on that stakeholder side of all of this. Open door, he will talk to anyone. He basically has an open door policy, so whoever wants to talk to him gets to see him. And then, of course, the European Parliament had to be brought on side because the Parliament was going to agree had to agree to any treaty outcome. So that's the institutions, but then the EU developed a set of methods around this. And here it was the Commission came to the fore because the Commission is, as we know, a technocratic institution, also political, but it has a lot of knowledge resources. There is nothing about the EU and the 35 chapters of the Acquis that there isn't a unit in the Commission can develop the position paper or do the homework over in a couple of days. And in order to ensure that all of the member states understood the technicalities, because of course the other dimension of Brexit is that untangling almost 40 years of engagement in a legal and policy framework is extremely difficult. And so before the negotiations began in mid-2017, the Commission ran seminar after seminar after seminar involving member states, institutions, to get everyone on the same page when it came to the technical details, to get member state buy-in. And when the history of Brexit will be written, there'll be a chapter on slides, because slides have been used. The Commission put up these slides. Didn't matter what the subject was, they were up within a couple of hours. So the other decision, and this was Barnier on transparency, and he says, we say everything every day to everybody. But Barnier's instinct was that if he didn't have transparency, he would simply have continuous leaks from all of the players involved in these negotiations. So he decided transparency is much better than leaks. And in fact, it's probably become a model that on, for example, trade negotiations, the EU will actually try to use more transparency in the future. So the other, I won't talk about the other method that the EU used, which was not required by Article 50, was the phased negotiations. So they used leverage. They said for the withdrawal negotiations, we won't begin to talk about the future unless we've made sufficient progress on the divorce. And so they created deadlines within the negotiations, which were already time-bound, in order to have pressure points. And all of this was done. So in terms of defending interests, one could argue that it should have been easier for the UK as one state to determine what its preferences were about Brexit than for EU 27 with 27 member states with a comparatively weak centre. But it turns out, in fact, that the EU knew what it wanted from Brexit much more than the United Kingdom did. And in terms of interests, two of them were very predictable, citizens and money in terms of the divorce. The one that one wouldn't have predicted at the beginning was the Ireland and the Irish border. And then those other two that come up time and time and time again in the documents, the union's interest and the principles. And all of that is to do with the integrity of the EU as a collective, the autonomy of decision-making, etc., etc. So now to the negotiations. As we know, I'm just checking my time.
You have, actually you only have 1 minute, but why don't you take 6?
Okay, I'll take 6. So we know the timing of we know the phase 1 and phase 2 of the negotiations. I will, rather than go through citizens and budgets where both the EU and the UK were broadly satisfied with the outcome here, and the budget, of course, the final budget, the breakthrough was in Florence when Theresa May came to give her speech in September 17, yes, when she said that no member state would be out of pocket because of the British departure. But let me very quickly say something on why Ireland became key. Anyone who knew Britain and Ireland and who understood the history of those two islands could have said that this was the unsolvable problem, that there was no Brexit that no good solution to Brexit for the island of Ireland. It's a contested land border. It's a border that has more crossings than the entire eastern borders and frontiers of the EU. So it is dotted with border crossings. It's basically cannot be patrolled and controlled. And there is a problem as to where the border is. And you see a photograph there where if you're driving on one side of the road, you're in the United Kingdom. And if you're driving on the other side of the road, you're in the EU. And this border has always been historically contested. But of course, it was not just a contested border, but it was a border that was manned by very, very many and very high British Army watchtowers for well over 30 years. And because of two things, because of the Good Friday Agreement, the British Army disappeared, and because of the internal market, the border disappeared. So for all intents and purposes, living on that border, it really didn't matter other than the road signs north of the border were white and miles, and south of the border were yellow and kilometres. But also, if you look at the geography of that map of who voted for Brexit, the blue is the Brexit vote in Northern Ireland. It's the DUP heartlands miles from the border. So all of the people who live on the border did not and do not consent to Brexit and will never consent to a return to the borders of the past. So the British were faced with literally, if you leave the single market and you leave the customs union and you leave most EU regimes, you will have to have checks somewhere, and there are only two possible places, the land border or the sea border, and neither of them are good news, but the land border is less problematic than the other. Now, just to very quickly on where we are now. So the negotiations this week are looking at level playing field, they're looking at fish, and we will know within this week, next week, or the week after, whether or not there will be a deal or no deal. In other words, it will require the negotiators to go into what they call the tunnel to hammer out the legal outcome. But the big issue is the degree of market access that the United Kingdom will have. And the problem in terms of market access is that the UK basically argues that it leaves the single market, leaves the customs union, leaves the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and simply wants a Canada deal. But that's not true. The British don't want a Canada deal. They want a Canada plus, 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 plus. And whenever David Frost talks about practical arrangements, he's effectively talking about privileged access to the market. To give one example on rules of origin, the British have asked that on rules of origin, that components that are non-European would be considered British. So for the car industry, components that are Turkish and Japanese, somehow or other when they arrive in the United Kingdom, are British. And the EU is saying, tough, no. There's also, this was an EU notice issued to those who export fertilizers from the United Kingdom to the EU this morning. And basically, those businesses will have to change their labels, change their markings, and will have to ensure that the fertilizers are checked in EU-accredited laboratories. So right across whole swathes of the British economy, business doesn't know yet what kind of deal it will get. And none of it, it's so thin that there is no way. A deal is better than no deal, I would argue, but there's no way that there will not be major, major disruption across sectors, across logistics, regardless of a deal or no deal. It's so thin the obligations that they want to commit to are so thin that they're unlikely to get it from the EU. So very quickly, to wrap up, the EU appears to me to be determined to protect and preserve the gains of integration. They're determined that membership must matter I would argue that the UK thought that its size gave it leverage. In fact, in my view, it would be much easier for the EU to deal with a small country leaving than a large. And the UK will have to come to terms either by the 1st of January next year or at a later stage that you cannot be a country in Europe without reaching an accommodation with the EU. So either they will reach it a thin deal now that will be built on, because I think it will be built on, that relationship will be built back. But if there's no deal, the British will have to come back to the table at some future date, but having caused so much disruption that the negotiations will be much tougher. So I leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, Yves, I was going to introduce you, but Brigid did such a wonderful job that I see no need. Everybody knows who you are, so it's time for your commentary.
Thank you very much. Let me say first that I'm very pleased to see the audience on the terrace of Villa Schifanoia. It's a wonderful spot, and I envy you to suffer from heat. I would like to share that suffering, I have to say. Okay, so the first image, which is on the screen, was inspired by the small road of Ulster, or between Ulster and Highland that Brigid showed. And as you can see from this road, it's quite straight. But, you know, at the end of the road, it's also quite steep. And really, the last day, the future days and weeks will be quite difficult. So let's go to the next slide. It seems to me that what we observe during this whole phase of negotiation is a kind of a frontal shock between politics and technical expertise. Actually, I believe that the British government or the British elites believe that they could solve the problem mainly through politics and by exerting the power that a great nation like Great Britain could use in order to twist the arm of its counterpart, or by dividing and ruling by negotiating, let's say, in the back with every member state. And on the opposite, the European Union, which is not yet a full-fledged polity, had one instrument, which was the rules. And the strength of the European Union has to be to stick to the rules. And I have not a point of disagreement with Brigid, because I share fully extremely interesting and fascinating analysis. But I think she might have emphasized slightly more one dimension related to unity. That is, at a certain point, the 27 member states have understood that it was a matter of life or death for the European Union. That is, the European Union is a rather fragile political system, a compound polity, but this fragility is compensated by extremely strict rules in matter of single market, customs union, the supremacy of the European law, the competence of the European Court. And once you start to take one stone of this, let's say, defensive wall, everything can collapse. So you have no other chance to survive than to stick to these stones and to these walls which have been built up over time from the beginning of the European integration. And Then there was certainly a big effort to sell this unity principle both to the member states, to the public opinion, etc. But the fact that the member states feared the collapse of the entire construction was certainly very important. There was also, I have to say, in this frontal shock between political and technical expertise, uh, a strong information imbalance. What surprised me very much at the very beginning of the negotiations and during this process is, it seems, the complete ignorance on the British side of what I call the law of necessary consequences. For instance, the case which has been illustrated by Brigid about the border. If you anymore a member of the European Union, having a common border for the customs union is absolutely crucial. And I think the British did not realize that Ulster was really a pain in the neck, not only technically, but also politically, because of the European, because of the Good Friday Agreement in particular. Next, next slide. Yes. So what also struck me in all this process was, on one hand, there was some kind of wishful thinking on the British side, expecting that it would be possible again to negotiate or to push on the weak points, but it was member states very positive usually vis-à-vis Greenland, were among the strongest advocates of sticking to the rope. Next. The paradox is that during these negotiations, and because of what Brigid has exposed very, very clearly, and that the Great Britain, as the government, has been extremely divided. The strength of the European Union has been to keep at bay not only the national interest, but also the sector within the European Union, and to make sure that these sectoral interests would not weaken the position, or rather striking that for once the main EU institutions, the Council, the Commission, and the Parliament, have worked hand in hand. On the opposite side, as everyone knows, the UK government was divided, the country was divided, the political parties were divided, and this has certainly not contributed to the strength of the negotiation capacity of the government. The issue of transparency versus secrecy has been also shows a strong opposition between the two sides. Secrecy is part of, I would say, the political and administrative tradition of Great Britain. Transparency on the side of the European Union is often a kind of obscure transparency, because if you are not an expert in Eurospeak, or if you are not an expert in EU processes, sometimes the transparency is not so obvious. There is transparency, but you don't understand what's going on. This time, I think Barnier and his team have done a very good job by opening the dossier, opening the doors, which was probably the best instrument in order to avoid to avoid free riding. We also observe an extremely difference in policy styles. I mean, you cannot think of more different let's say, leaders in their own capacities, and Johnson and Barnier. And what strikes me also that in many instances, because of this focus on populist politics, the British have been forced to put emphasis more on form than substance. For instance, the final agreement which has been agreed by Johnson was, after all, not that different from the one which was secured by Theresa May. There were differences, but not as substantial as Johnson has pretended, for the sake of his own glory or power. Next. Well, you can go next. What's next? Please, go ahead. Yeah. Okay, deal or no deal? I would say bets are open. And indeed, even today, for instance, or yesterday, we had two types of news which seem to contradict themselves. The first one was rumors according to which in the forthcoming budgetary bill, which will be discussed, if I'm not wrong, next week by the British Parliament, the intention of the government was to introduce a certain number of norms or decisions which would constitute a new violation of the agreement between the EU and Great Britain. It might be that it's just a leak in order to put further pressure on the European Union, but anyway, there is this kind of information. Today, The Guardian was announcing that new positions have been proposed by the British negotiators, in particular in the field of fisheries. It's certainly not, let's say, close to the position of the European Union, but at least something is moving. So I've quoted Louis XV, who is supposed to say that after me, le déluge. But sometimes you really wonder if Johnson and his government are not choosing the most risky way because again, of populist politics. I think in this negotiation, the British side have 5 weaknesses. The first one is uncertainty. Johnson government pretends that they wish to set up a global Britain, but nobody knows really what global Britain is. It might mean very different kind of Britain. The second weakness is the trade structure and production flows. Most of the trade of Great Britain is between the European Union and Great Britain, and the production flows are largely dependent on bits and pieces which are produced on the continent as well. So not having a deal would be extremely costly, certainly for the European Union, but the cost would be divided between the entire Union. It would be more costly, to such a point that in a recent poll, 80% of the business community in Great Britain favors a deal, and only 4% would like a no deal solution. The third weakness is the economic and social fabric of UK. Singapore is often presented as a potential model, and after all, I think the Singapore model could work perfectly well if the relationship between the European Union was not with Great Britain, but the European Union and the city. Well, in that case, I don't see any problem, but the city, in spite of being so crucial for Great Britain, the city is not the entire UK. And fourth, vicinity. As it has been underlined recently, I think, by John Portas and another colleague, deal or no deal, Britain is there at 30 kilometers or 30 miles from the continent. And the flows of services, of products, tourism, etc., all goes mainly in the direction of relationship between the continent and Great Britain. So there is nothing that we can change about that. And the fifth weakness is the internal territorial challenge, because first Ulster, but also secondly Scotland, are or may become serious problems for the UK if there is a no deal. In front of these 5 British weaknesses, I see 5 points of strength. Next slide. Yes, 5 British assets. The first one is obviously the city, which is a power within power. Secondly, a service-oriented economy, which might help to overcome, say, the difficulties. The third one is attractiveness, education, research, the capacity of the British government, contrary to what happens in continental Europe, to attract migrants, including migrants from the European Union, which are highly educated, which are skilled workers. And this is a big difference, for instance, with France or even Germany. It's certainly a big asset. English is obviously a fourth asset to strengthen the global Britain idea. And I would say fifth, resilience, because I'm full of admiration for the capacity of the British people to face the new situation which they have to swallow for half of them, and they seem ready at least to do as much as good as possible in spite of this adverse situation. Conclusion, and that would be what will prevail? Well, burning the boats. Well, that's a possibility. It would be certainly a disaster, and instead of putting the image of a road on which there would be on which there is no car and no traffic, I could put the picture of a road jammed with trucks and cars, etc. It might happen anywhere, even if there is a deal, because, as Brigid underlined, so little as preparation has been done due to the fact that negotiations are still in a stalemate. Burning the boats seems to me an extremely costly exercise, in particular within the context of COVID and all the rest. Well, let's hope that at the end there would be a kind of win-win agreement. And if I had to bet, I would still bet probably for this second option, given that the first one would bring so much gloom and doom. There is still probably the possibility of an agreement. But sometimes you really wonder, and I have no answer to that. Brigid might have some clues. I don't understand the British strategy. For instance, the latest move whereby the British government states that he is ready to violate the legal agreements that it has signed. I imagine that the British government, the British negotiators, think that such a weapon could help in negotiating with the European Union. My view is that it had exactly the opposite effect. That is, in Brussels, I don't think they have been very much impressed by these violation, and which is quite extraordinary because it's rare that a government says, I have signed an agreement, but I intend to violate it. Usually, violation of international agreements are done, but without saying it, without writing it. So if Brigid can explain to me why such a move has been taken by the British government, certainly I would be happy to get a better understanding. Well, let me finish by saying that Brigid is entering into last year at EY. I think in the follow-up of Helen Wallace and Stefano Bartolini, she has done a great job. And it's a pity that there is this guillotine rule which force you to leave the European Institute. But I'd hope that your successor would be at least as good as you, and that the Schumann Center will prosper and flourish as it has done up to now. Thank you very much.
So Brigid, take 5 minutes to respond.
No, I think just answer the
Go straight to
question.
questions. Okay, so we're gonna go straight to questions. I think we're gonna take them 3 at a time. We'll do 2 from the audience, and then if there's questions from the remote, we'll get those as well. So let's have 1. Let's have a second question. 2. Okay. Yeah, you need the microphone.
No, I don't. I shouldn't touch the microphone.
No, you must have the microphone,
Okay.
also why the camera won't work properly.
Oh, okay.
Okay. But first of all, I'm sorry. I'm Jean Pisani, Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa Chair here at the Institute. Thank you for putting structure, conceptual clarity into what has been an extremely messy process, the details of which have been, we all have lost at some point. And I think you brought this clarity, and I think that's absolutely needed to understand and to really analyze what has happened. I share every criticism on what has been done on the British side. I have some reservation on your characterization of the EU. You said it has been rapid, united, and effective. And I agree, but my question is, what do we mean by effectiveness? What was the goal? And I would say that we've been dominated by the obsession of unity, and we haven't had a clear view of what the strategic goal of the EU was in this negotiation. At some point you said the EU knew what it wanted from Brexit. I would say the EU knew what it didn't want from Brexit, but it didn't know what it wanted from Brexit. For example, on the issue of regulatory competition, which is a big question for the future in fields like data, in fields like biotech, what the risks, what's our assessment of the risk of regulatory competition, and how much are we willing to pay to control this risk? I don't think we gave any answer. It's been totally dominated by process. So it has been a triumph of process over strategy. That would be my characterization.
We'll take 3 questions at once, and then we'll have response. Is it Philip?
So, hi, I'm Philip Genschel, a joint chair here at the Schumann Center. I have 2 brief questions. First is, what makes Brexit so beautiful? Rapid, united, effective are not attributes you usually connect to the EU. You said, well, there was the need to protect gains from integration, but that's also true for all the other crises we have seen recently. Yves said it was a matter of life and death for the EU, but again, that's what we have heard about the other crises, and still there we saw slowness, ineffectiveness, and division. And the second question plays a bit on what Jean just said. Could there be too much of a good thing? So, if you are so united in negotiating with a disunited, fragmented partner, could it not be that you leave out options for a mutually beneficial deal? Why, for instance, is fisheries important for the EU at all? Why don't we say, okay, you can have all the fish you want, but we determine the rules in finance, for instance?
Nothing? Is that, you have is there a question there? Okay.
So there's a question from the audience online. Transparency has been prioritized in the negotiations, but how will this play out in the equally important joint committee and specialized committee deliberations?
Okay, I'm gonna make a brief comment while Brigid prepares a response. I'm just gonna ask the question whether perhaps unity and strength is a reflection of the weakness of the opposition. It's somehow easier to be unified if your opponents make complete idiots of themselves and ask for things they can't possibly have. If they made reasonable demands, it might have been somewhat easier for them to divide the EU. If you make unreasonable demands, I think it's very easy to be unified in response. Okay, Brigid, the floor is yours. We've taken up enough of your time.
So thank you all. Great questions. I think, Jean, you're absolutely right on the effectiveness. And so when I used it, I thought, yeah, someone's going to say it. How do you define effectiveness? So I don't think it's been just a triumph process. I think the EU understood that this was a major existential issue for it as a political system and as a in terms of its market power. And there was a palpable sense in the interviews with those very close to that first reaction of, we can lose control of this, and the domino and contagion. And if you remember from the Eurozone crisis, so this fear of contagion. And that meant the EU became very defensive. I think the second is that protective sense also was to do with who was leaving. I think if it was a small country, the system would have been very relaxed. But here was a large country leaving with the assets that Yves mentioned, but also determined to diverge. It was, the only reason you do Brexit is if you want to diverge. So the EU was very concerned about making concessions to the UK in terms of market access and disturbing the equilibrium between rights and obligations. So, for example, the City of London wanted mutual recognition. But mutual recognition for a non-member state is completely different to mutual recognition within the EU when there are processes, procedures, rules, and a court. And so I think that risk of regulatory divergence, protecting against unpredictable divergence was really important. Now, strategically, what did the EU want? It wanted, and it continues to want, as close as possible a partnership with the United Kingdom based on reasonable rights and obligations. And the thing about the UK is, and I think Yves captured this, the UK, its policy style is very much, let's agree as gentlemen and not pin down rules. And the British much prefer precedent and much prefer so-called pragmatism. But the problem is the EU would then become very vulnerable to what the British might do. So I'm not sure that I buy the lack of a strategic goal, but of course there are costs to that protectiveness of the system, which is that we will end up with a very, at least at the beginning, a distant relationship with the UK. But I think that will be rebuilt unless we think the UK is different unless we think the UK can afford to ignore where it is. But I'm not sure the UK can afford to ignore where it is, simply the gravity of exchange and of trade. And also, I think what's been exposed in the Brexit process, and this goes to what David said, the weakness of the UK on reasonable demands, I think it's exposed a real problem with British state capacity, that the British system has really struggled to handle Brexit, to handle the technical side. And I know from interviews in the Commission that they were constantly surprised at the poor quality of submissions on some issues. And they expected the British to be better than that. And I think in terms of trade, suddenly the British have to negotiate a major trade agreement, but they haven't had to do it for so long. And so they didn't have the expertise, they didn't have the memory, they didn't have the people. And I think when you turn to a former Australian Prime Minister who knows nothing about trade and think that that's a good idea, that tells me there's something going on in the British system that surprises me. And I think it comes back to in the referendum, Cameron was determined that no one did any prep for leave. And only two parts of the British system did. The Bank of England rightly knew if it was no or leave, they needed to be there the first day, and the Treasury. But the rest of the British system, no homework, no knowledge of what this might mean, no understanding of the depth of entanglement of the British. So I think long term, regardless if there is a deal, I think this will be rebuilt into an association type deal eventually, but it'll take time and it will require movement. On the why Brexit is beautiful and why, I think Yves is that contagion, that importance of membership has to matter, because why should any country accept the constraints of membership if you can get a good deal and you're a large country and you're outside? And also, I think it was partly also the Swiss experience in that the EU had come to the understanding that multiple deals with one party without an overarching governance regime makes life very miserable indeed. And I remember a very senior Commission official, after they had reached the withdrawal agreement, she said, and we will be negotiating with these people forever and ever and ever, and they'll be worse than the Swiss. So in other words, that sense of Britain was a large state and needed to be protected. Interestingly, and I think the case of Ireland is extraordinary, because here is a very small country on the northwest periphery, and it successfully managed to upload its issue to the EU, and it successfully managed to get 26 countries to back it to the hilt. And when a Polish foreign minister did a slight wobble one time, he was shut down very quickly. So I think that goes back to the membership. The membership must matter. On the question on transparency, I think that's a really good question, and I doubt that the joint committee deliberations or those specialised committees governing the withdrawal agreement, or if there is eventually an agreement, will be quite as transparent as the negotiations. But I do think that the Commission and the EU system should review how it has handled these negotiations to see what lessons should be learned for other big negotiations, external negotiations in terms of trade. And I think Sabine Weyand moving from the task force as Director General in Trade may bring that knowledge.
Okay, I'm going to have to call people out by their dress since I don't recognize you at this distance. Black shirt, yeah, and short beard. Do we have I see, okay. So.
Hello, hi, Mariusz Bogacki, first year SPS researcher at the UI, and I have question to both of you, or I guess a request for comment to both of you. Brigid, rightly so, you mentioned the importance of the Irish question, but I'm wondering about your opinion, or if you can shed some light on the Scottish question, and if there is such a thing as Scottish question, and what's the position of the EU on Scotland, and is there any chance for support for the independence, and if there's any talks about it at all? Thank you.
Actually, my question follows on slightly from this. There was a nice division made between the technocratic side of the EU and the political side of the UK on Brexit. But has that been a problem for the EU? The EU has been fundamentally unable to shape British politics in any way. It's been unable to engage with one of the largest pro-EU movements in Europe that has developed in Britain since 2016. It was very determined not to upset the apple cart of Theresa May's administration in order to not let Boris Johnson into government, which has failed completely. And there's been incredulity, I think, from quite a few members of the Scottish government that the EU hasn't made any political overtures towards a very strong European movement there.
Another question from YouTube to both speakers. If you had to bet, how many chances do you give to a no-deal scenario?
You want to go first? Or you want to let Yves go first?
Yves should.
Yves, you go first to answer these, and then we'll go to Brigid.
Well, I'm ready to bet for a deal, but not much money. No, really, I think nobody knows. I have recently spoken to one of my former students who worked in the Barnier's team, and they are all in the blue about the possible outcome. I think everybody still hopes that a deal will be reached, but the problem is that the longest way to come to a deal has to be done on the British side, in particular because Boris Johnson has put the stakes at a very, and it's what I don't understand, the stakes at a very high level, so much that he declares that he's ready to violate the previous agreement. So how do you come back on such, let's say, declaration? We have seen in the past agreement that actually Johnson, at the end, has agreed to much of the content of the agreement negotiated by Theresa May. So let's hope that it's a kind of a bet on the side of the British government. Let's get as much as we can, including by negotiating or by pretending to get impossible things. I think, as I said, there are a confusion on the British side about what can be trade-off, what is negotiable, and what is not. For instance, if I may take an example, I think you can negotiate probably a lot of things with the Catholic Church, but if you ask the Pope to negotiate his infallibility, well, you might be unsuccessful. And so it's the same for the European Union. You can probably negotiate a lot on fisheries, on trade, on banking, etc. But you can't ask the European Union to renounce to the basic foundations which would have as a consequence the complete collapse of the whole system. That's the problem.
So starting with the bet, I would still put money on a deal, and for the following reason. The United Kingdom is not self-sufficient in food. And it's a very brave government indeed, creates supply chain problems for supermarkets in January, February and March. And I'm not sure Johnson is that mad. I think he will. There are people in number 10 very close to him who would just go for creative destruction now. Let it fall where it falls. But I think he will think, we have handled COVID badly, the Conservative government. Starmer is getting him on competence. And so all that would really add to this would be supermarket shelves without food, January, February and March. So I still expect a deal, but like Yves, I wouldn't be inclined to bet too much, and certainly not my house. On the Scottish question, so I think that during the last Scottish independent referendum, the EU was neither supportive of Scottish independence or particularly involved. And of course, the worry is Spain and Catalonia. I think the fact that Scotland has been taken out of the EU against the overwhelming majority of Scottish voters, over 62%, then Scotland, if it becomes an independent state, can and would in my view apply for EU membership and would be granted it. But would the EU come out in a referendum environment and say we support Scottish independence? No, I don't expect that. On the interesting question of the engagement of the EU with UK society, I think once the vote happened, it was extremely difficult for the EU to engage because it had to deal with the government. It was formally a constitutional issue. The EU was leaving. Yes, one of the consequences of Brexit is there are probably now more pro-EU voters in the UK than there are in many other countries. But it took the Leave vote to understand what was being lost. And in terms of British politics, I don't think outside forces could change the dynamic of British politics. There is, between now and 2024, the Conservatives have a very healthy majority. So the question is, what could one envisage happening in 2024 that would change that? And remember, Labour isn't likely to do well north of the border in Scotland. So where is Labour going to get a majority from? Or could it get a coalition outcome? And that's, I think, where the big issue is in British politics now. And we know the polls suggest that Starmer is doing well, but then that really comes down to the seats, because it's, as an electoral system, it's one of the most undemocratic in Europe. And I think that's it.
Okay. I'm told, I believe if we're patient, we will have drinks served to us. Is that correct? So I ask people to remain in their seats. Informal conversations can take place now, but we'll end the formalities, and anybody who would like to be served a drink should stay where they are. Let's have a nice round of applause for all the speakers, questioners, for Yves and Mény for coming to us, for Brigid, and for the drinks.
May I join you?
You may join us, Yves.
Yeah, you may join us, Yves.
But you've got to come and visit.
Okay, I go to the fridge.
And you have to come and visit us.
Excuse me?
You must come to Florence.
You must come to Florence.
Okay. Difficult.
I will say, by the way, speaking for myself, I don't expect that Boris Johnson will be Prime Minister of the UK in January.
Ah, this is a new bet.
So we can bet on that if you like.
Okay, I bet you a fine bottle of wine. He will
Okay,
be.
done. I don't see how you can possibly last that long.
Apparently, we have to stay in our seats.
We cannot get up and wander for the drinks. People that would like to go, of course, are welcome to go. Nobody's obligated to stay.
No one's obligated to have a glass of
We're not a prison camp. Well, if you'd like a drink, you must remain patiently in your seats.
Oh, a Allora, grazie.
And the great thing about being in the front is you get served first, apparently.
It was. I hope people weren't too hot during. It was.
Oh, I was glad when the sun went down behind the trees, I have to say.
It was getting me. It was getting me
know,
right
I
in
know.
the face.
You had the opposite. I had it
I
coming
had
from
it-
this side. You had it coming from that side. I think we were lucky in the sense in the front. I think.
Fear stuff.
That's a bit. It's funny. There's a lot of misunderstanding between the UK and the EU.
Yeah, but
And a part of so that feeling on the part of the EU completely misunderstands UK politics. Because I mean, you talk to somebody like Martin Wolf, who's a pro-EU, the columnist for the
Yeah.
Financial Times. He's a pro-EU guy, right? He has no comprehension of EU whatsoever. The four freedoms don't mean a single thing to him. He does not understand the deepness